they send me away, teach me how to be sensible.
Over 60 million albums sold worldwide. 4 consecutive platinum albums in the United States. Breakfast in America spent 5 weeks at #1 on the Billboard 200, selling over 20 million copies and winning 2 Grammy Awards. The Logical Song reached #6 in the US and #7 in the UK, a feat matched by only a handful of prog rock bands in history. They filled stadiums across 5 continents and defined the sound of intelligent pop music in the late 1970s. Supertramp wasn't just successful. They were unstoppable. Then it all collapsed. Roger Hodgson, the voice behind their biggest hits, left the band at the absolute peak of their success. Creative wars between 2 leaders tore the group in half. A verbal agreement about who could perform which songs was broken, leading to decades of bitterness. Members went years refusing to speak to each other. The music that made millions couldn't bridge the gap between 2 men who could no longer paint on the same canvas. Critics called their post-Hodgson work uninspired. Fans called it Supertramp without the soul. At Madison Square Garden in Tate-Tino, 1979, Supertramp performed to 20,000 screaming fans celebrating the Breakfast in America tour. 4 years later, Roger Hodgson walked away from all of it, choosing his family and creative freedom over superstardom. Rick Davies continued performing under the Supertramp name, but audiences noticed immediately. The high, spiritual voice was gone. The melodic heart of their biggest songs had vanished. Within 5 years of Hodgson's departure, album sales plummeted. Brother, Where You Bound sold less than 3 million copies, a commercial disaster compared to Breakfast in America's 20 million. The band that once commanded stadiums was playing smaller venues. Critics who once hailed them as progressive pop pioneers now struggled to find relevance in their work. This is the story of how 2 completely different voices created something magical together, then watched it shatter because those differences became too great to reconcile. How 5 working-class musicians from Britain became global superstars, then fractured over something as simple as creative control. How the very tension that made their music brilliant became the poison that destroyed them. But to understand the collapse, we have to go back to 1969 to London, where none of this seemed remotely possible. London, 1969. This wasn't swinging London anymore. The psychedelic dream was dying. The Beatles were falling apart. The hippie movement was collapsing under its own weight. This was post-optimism Britain, where the economy was struggling, where the working class was still the working class, and where becoming a successful musician meant beating impossible odds. That's where Supertramp were born. In August 1969, Rick Davies placed an ad in Melody Maker, the Bible of British musicians. Genuine opportunity. What he didn't mention was that he had backing, actual financial support from a Dutch millionaire named Stanley August Missegius. Missegius had supported Davies since 1968, believing the young keyboardist from Swindon had something special. Davies was working class, raised by a hairdresser mother and a merchant seaman father. His father died in 1973, but before that, Davies had learned one crucial lesson. Nothing was guaranteed. You had to work for everything. Roger Hodgson answered, the ad. And in that moment, everything changed. Hodgson was Davies' complete opposite. Where Davies was gritty, blues-based, and cynical, Hodgson was refined, classically influenced, and spiritual. Davies had grown up in Swindon, surrounded by working-class struggle. Hodgson had attended British boarding school, the kind of place that bred both privilege and psychological scars. Their voices were different. Davies, a raspy baritone, sometimes pushing into an unusual falsetto. Hodgson, a high, clear tenor that could soar over complex arrangements without losing emotional weight. Their songwriting was different. Davies wrote about darkness, alienation, and harsh reality. Hodgson wrote about longing, philosophy, and the search for meaning. But when they met at that audition, something clicked. Not despite their differences, because of them. The original lineup formed quickly, Davies on keyboards and vocals, Hodgson on bass, guitar, and vocals, Richard Palmer James on lyrics and guitar, Robert Miller on drums, Frank Farrell on bass. They named themselves Supertramp after the autobiography of a Supertramp by William Henry Davies, a book about a homeless wanderer searching for meaning. It was perfect. They signed with A&M Records in 1970, one of the first acts on the label's new UK branch. Finally, a real shot. Their first album, Supertramp, came out in 1970. It failed completely. Their second album, Indelibly Stamped, came out. In 1971, it also failed completely. By 1972, Miesegeist was done. He pulled his funding. The band collapsed. Everyone left except Davies and Hodgson. This should have been the end of Supertramp. Instead, it became the beginning of the classic lineup. Davies and Hodgson rebuilt from scratch. They spent 2 years writing over 40 songs, determined to get it right. They recruited 3 new members, John Helliwell on saxophone and woodwinds, Dougie Thompson on bass, and Bob Siebenberg, credited at the time as Bob C. Benberg, on drums. A&M Records agreed to give them one more chance, but they sent them somewhere unusual, a 17th century farm in West Dorset, far from London's distractions. Southcombe Farm, Thorncombe. For months, this lineup lived together, ate together, breathed together. Davies and Hodgson wrote relentlessly. The tension between their styles, Davies' jazz blues grit and Hodgson's progressive pop melodies, wasn't a problem anymore. It was the sound. But even in the beginning, the seeds of destruction were already there. Hodgson later said that working on Crime of the Century, the song, was one of the most collaborative moments of their partnership. Davies and Hodgson bouncing ideas off each other for weeks. But he also noted that as time went on, collaboration became harder. The philosophical gulf between them was real, they just didn't know it yet. Crime of the Century came out in September 1974. It peaked at number 4 in the UK. It reached number 38 in the US, not a smash, but enough. In Canada, it went to number 1 and stayed on the charts for over 2 years. It was eventually certified Diamond in Canada, signifying over 1 million copies sold. But chart positions don't tell the whole story. Crime of the Century was different. It wasn't just progressive rock, it wasn't just pop, it was both, seamlessly blended with lyrics that mattered. School was about the trauma of education systems that crush individuality. Dreamer was a perfect radio hit with philosophical depth. Bloody Well Right had jazz funk swagger and a sax solo that radio stations actually played. This was the album where Rick Davies and Roger Hodgson proved their opposing styles weren't a weakness. They were Supertramp's superpower. Davies' darker, realism grounded Hodgson's soaring idealism. Hodgson's melodies softened Davies' cynicism, and critics noticed. Rolling Stone later included Crime of the Century in their 50 greatest prog rock albums of all time. Fans connected with lyrics about alienation, pressure, and loneliness, themes that felt brutally honest in 1974. The band toured relentlessly. Their reputation grew. Their fan base expanded. By 1975, they were headlining across Europe and North America. But there was a catch. Davies and Hodgson were becoming the co-leaders of Supertramp, and co-leadership is inherently unstable. In 1975, Supertramp released Crisis? What Crisis? It peaked at number 20 in the UK. Commercially, it wasn't as big as Crime of the Century, but it reinforced their reputation as a band with substance. The introspective tone resonated with loyal fans. The album showed they weren't one-hit wonders. Then came 1977. Even in the quietest moments, this was the album that pushed them toward mainstream success. Give a Little Bit became a lasting anthem of hope and generosity. It charted at number C15 in the US. Fool's Overture, written by Hodgson, was a complex, multi-part song that showcased their progressive ambitions. The album reached number 16 in the US. For the first time, Supertramp had a genuine hit single. Radio stations that had ignored them before were now playing them constantly. The fan base wasn't just cult followers anymore, it was mainstream. They were on the verge of something massive, and in 1979 they delivered Breakfast in America. Released in March 1979, it became one of the best-selling albums of all time. It spent 5 weeks at #1 on the Billboard 200. It peaked at #3 in the UK. Over 20 million copies sold worldwide. 2 Grammy Awards. The singles were unstoppable. The Logical Song, written by Hodgson, a philosophical meditation on education and lost innocence. #6 in the US, #7 in the UK. Goodbye Stranger, written by Davies, a bluesy goodbye with emotional punch. #15 in the US. Take the Long Way Home, written by Hodgson, a song about identity and purpose. #10 in the US. Breakfast in America, the title track, light and catchy. #9 in the US. This wasn't just commercial success. This was cultural dominance. Supertramp filled Madison Square Garden. They played to sold-out stadiums across the world. The 1979-1980 World Tour was massive. The live album, Paris, captured their peak. Flawless musicianship, perfect vocal harmonies, and a setlist that balanced their progressive roots with their pop hits. At that moment in 1980, Supertramp was one of the biggest bands on the planet. They had achieved what most musicians only dream of: critical acclaim and commercial triumph. But beneath this triumph, something dark was growing. Rick Davies and Roger Hodgson split songwriting credits equally on most Supertramp songs, even though the songs themselves were often clearly written by one or the other. This wasn't unusual, John. Lennon and Paul McCartney did the same thing. It worked as long as both partners trusted each other, but trust was eroding. Davies wanted Supertramp to stay grounded in blues and jazz influences. He wanted darker, more cynical material. He saw the band as his vehicle, the project he'd built from scratch after the first 2 albums failed. Hodgson wanted to explore spiritual themes and lighter melodies. He wanted creative freedom to experiment. He felt constrained by the Supertramp formula. As he later told Rolling Stone in 1983, "Supertramp, for me, has stopped being a vehicle in which I can grow. I found that I was stagnating, really." The tension was visible during the recording of their 7th studio album, Famous Last Words, released in October 1982. Hodgson described it as the most difficult album they'd ever made. "All of the albums have been difficult to record," he said, "but a sense of togetherness always forced its way through. With this one, it was very difficult to make any headway, and the best songs fell by the wayside. Recording was not enjoyable. It ground to a halt several times. The liner notes for the album told the whole story. Each song was color-coded by author. Hodgson's songs, Crazy, It's Raining Again, Know Who You Are, Sit Laban, and the heartbreakingly titled Don't Leave Me Now. Davies' songs, Put On Your Old Brown Shoes, Bonnie, My Kind of Lady, and Waiting So Long. They weren't collaborating anymore. They were sharing space. Drummer Bob Siebenberg later confirmed it. That was a difficult project to complete. Rick and Roger were really growing apart, and there were wars over where we were going to make the record. The album sold well, over 6 million copies. But it was a creative failure. Fans noticed the lack of chemistry. Critics sensed the band's internal fractures. And then came the decision that changed everything. In 1983, after a grueling world tour for Famous Last Words, Roger Hodgson quit Supertramp. The official reason, he wanted to spend more time with his family. The real reason, creative and philosophical differences with Rick Davies had become irreconcilable. "For a long time, I'd been upsetting the apple cart by saying that we needed fresh energy in Supertramp," Hodgson told Rolling Stone in 1983. But ultimately, Rick and the other guys realized that they wanted to stay together and they didn't want what I wanted. It was obvious that there was only one solution. Hodgson left, but he didn't leave quietly. According to Hodgson, he and Davies made a verbal agreement. Hodgson would keep his songs for his solo career. Davies would keep the Supertramp name. Davies would write new material, but Supertramp would not perform Hodgson's songs live. It was witnessed by other band members. It seemed fair. Davies honored the agreement for 5 years, and then he didn't. By the late 1980s, Davies was touring under the Supertramp name and performing Hodgson's biggest hits: Dreamer, The Logical Song, Give a Little Bit, Take the Long Way Home, Breakfast in America. Hodgson was furious. He advertised the whole tour with my songs and played 7 of them, Hodgson said in a 2010 interview with Prog magazine, which was basically him saying, "Fuck you, Hodgson. I'm going to do what I want." And that doesn't feel good. When Hodgson confronted Davies, the response was evasive. "He's very sheepish," Hodgson said, and says he's basically getting a lot of pressure from everyone to do the songs. "I can understand the pressure because me and my songs were such a huge part of Supertramp." The bitterness never healed. In 2010, Davies performed at the O2 Arena in London, playing a setlist heavily featuring Hodgson's songs. Hodgson wasn't invited. He wasn't consulted. He wasn't even acknowledged. Hodgson told reporters he's playing songs he didn't even like at the time. The betrayal was complete. Supertramp without Roger Hodgson was technically still Supertramp. Rick Davies owned the trademark. The other members, John Helliwell, Dougie Thompson, Bob Siebenberg, stayed with Davies. But Supertramp without Hodgson's voice, without his melodies, without his spiritual counterbalance to Davies' cynicism, wasn't really Supertramp anymore. The proof came quickly. Brother Where You Bound, released in May 1985, was Supertramp's first album without Hodgson. It reached number 20 in the UK and number 21 in the US. Respectable, but a steep decline from Breakfast in America. Sales were around 3 million copies, solid, but nowhere near their peak. The album featured Cannonball, which became a modest hit. The title track, The Brother Where You Bound, was a 16-minute Cold War-themed epic with guitar solos from Pink Floyd's David Gilmour. It was ambitious, it was progressive. It was Rick Davies asserting his artistic vision, but it wasn't what fans wanted from Supertramp. The magic was gone. Critics noted the absence. Fans debated endlessly. Was Supertramp still Supertramp without Hodgson? Davies insisted yes. Hodgson's fans said no. The numbers told the story. Free as a Bird, 1987, sold even less. Live 88, 1988, barely registered. The band went on hiatus after 1988. Davies tried to revive Supertramp in the late 1990s with new lineups. Some Things Never Change, 1997, and Slow Motion, 2002, were released to indifferent responses. Tours happened, but they were smaller. The venues were smaller. The cultural impact was gone. Supertramp became a nostalgia act. A band people remembered for what they were in 1979, not what they were in 2002, and the bitterness between Davies and Hodgson only deepened. Attempts at reconciliation failed repeatedly. In 2005, there was an attempt to bring Hodgson back into the band. It went nowhere. In 2010, Hodgson publicly stated he'd offered to return if Davies would respect the original agreement and stop performing Hodgson's songs under the Supertramp name. Davies refused. The lawsuit started. In 2024, Roger Hodgson won a jury verdict in his attempt to end a 1977 royalty-sharing agreement that gave non-songwriting members of Supertramp, Thompson, Helliwell, and Siebenberg, a cut of his songwriting royalties. But in 2025, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned that verdict, reinstating the band's claim. The battle wasn't just about money, it was about legacy, it was about who owned the Supertramp story. And then, in September 2025, the story changed forever. Rick Davies died at his home in East Hampton, New York, at age 81, after a long battle with multiple myeloma. He'd been diagnosed in 2015. He'd retired from touring years earlier. The band issued a statement. Beyond the stage, Rick was known for his warmth, resilience, and devotion to his wife, Sue, with whom he shared over 5 decades. Rick's music and legacy continue to inspire many and bears testament to the fact that great songs never die, they live on. Roger Hodgson did not issue a public statement. The feud had outlived one of its participants. Today, Roger Hodgson is still touring. At 74 years old, he performs Supertramp's biggest hits to devoted audiences around the world. He plays The Logical Song, Dreamer, Give a Little Bit, Breakfast in America, Take the Long Way Home, and Fool's Overture. Fans come to hear the voice, the high clear tenor that defines Supertramp's sound, the spiritual soul of the band. Hodgson has released solo albums In the Eye of the Storm, 1984, Hi Hi, 1987, and Open the Door, 2000. They're good, they're well-crafted, but they never reached the heights of Breakfast in America because Hodgson without Davies lacked the grounding tension that made Supertramp great. Just as Davies without Hodgson lacked the melodic brilliance that made their music unforgettable, they needed each other, and they couldn't stand each other. John Helliwell, the saxophonist, occasionally performs in jazz projects. Dougie Thompson retired from performing and moved into music publishing. Bob Siebenberg, the drummer, is retired, but remains a respected figure in progressive rock circles. The band's legacy endures. Breakfast in America is still one of the 60 best-selling albums of all time. Crime of the Century is considered a progressive rock masterpiece. Songs like The Logical Song and Give a Little Bit are covered by new generations of artists. Supertramp influenced progressive pop and soft rock. They proved that intelligent lyrics and complex arrangements could coexist with radio-friendly melodies. Bands like Crowded House, Keane, and Coldplay owe something to Supertramp's fusion of art, rock, and accessibility. But the what if haunts every discussion. What if Davies and Hodgson had reconciled? What if they'd reunited for one final tour, one final album? What if they'd put aside their egos and their grievances and reminded the world why they were brilliant together? We'll never know. Rick Davies is gone. Roger Hodgson is still performing, but he's performing alone. Supertramp is remembered as a band that reached perfection and couldn't survive it. In 1982, shortly before the end, Rick Davies tried to explain the conflict. It's been said that there's a certain amount of friction, he told an interviewer. I think that's inevitable when you're involved in a creative process. It's like two people are painting a picture on the same canvas, and somebody wants to put red there and somebody wants to put blue. You have problems. The picture doesn't get finished. In the past, we've always been able to work around it. As we've progressed, it got more difficult. That's the tragedy of Supertramp. They painted one of the most beautiful pictures in rock history. But the two artists painting it couldn't agree on the colors anymore.